All right, so today we're going to dive deep into some really cool cancer research.
Yeah,
TREM2 specifically,
that's
right?
right.
You've been wanting to know more about how this receptor, I mean, it's found on macrophages, right?
Right.
And it could be like the key to some new immunotherapies.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing here is that TREM2, it plays this sort of dual role.
hmm
It helps regulate the immune system, but in cancer, it's like it switches sides,
Yeah.
often hindering, the immune response we need to actually fight the tumors.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what's so fascinating to researchers. Where TREM2 is this really complex protein, and understanding how it interacts with the immune system,
Mm,
especially those tumor-associated macrophages.
right, TAMs.
Yeah, TAMs is really crucial, you see, because TAMs can actually become protectors of the tumor, almost like a shield.
Wow. So instead of like gobbling up the bad guys, these macrophages are giving them a safe haven. That's crazy. How does that even happen?
Well, TREM2 normally functions as a sensor on macrophages, allowing them to sort of recognize damaged cells and clear them out. Uh-huh.
And it's also vital for controlling inflammation
Right.
and maintaining that really delicate immune balance.
Right.
But tumors can manipulate this pathway,
Oh, wow.
essentially hijacking TREM2 to send false signals to those TAMs.
So TREM2, which is usually like the conductor of a well-tuned orchestra, suddenly gets a rewritten score from the tumor,
Hmm.
and the whole symphony goes haywire.
That's a great analogy.
Mm.
And so instead of attacking,
Oh.
these CAMs actually start releasing immunosuppressive signals
Uh,
that silence other immune cells and prevent them from recognizing, and attacking the tumor.
it's like the tumor has not only bribed the guards, but given them like a gag order
Yeah,
for the rest of the army.
exactly.
This reminds me of some of the research that you sent me on liver, pancreatic, and non-small cell lung cancer.
Yeah.
Those are particularly troubling, weren't they?
Yes, these are cancers where TREM2 seems to be especially active, and unfortunately its presence is often linked to a much poorer prognosis. Yeah, that's why the idea of targeting TREM2 therapeutically is so exciting.
Right.
It's almost like turning the tables on the tumor, right?
Yeah.
If we can block those false signals, could we like reprogram the TAMs to become tumor fighters again?
That's the hope.
Yep.
And that's what researchers are actively investigating.
Okay.
There are a couple of approaches,
Okay.
and they both aim at disrupting TREM2 signaling.
Mm-hmm.
One is using antibodies that specifically bind to TREM2, preventing it from sending those immunosuppressive signals.
So it's like intercepting the tumor's fake instructions before they can reach the conductor's podium.
Exactly.
What's the other approach?
The other one is developing drugs
Okay.
that can directly interfere with TREM2 signaling pathways inside the cell itself. You're essentially disrupting the process at a more fundamental level.
Essentially blocking those bad instructions from being translated and acted upon.
Yeah.
This sounds really promising, but what does this actually mean for the tumor? How does blocking TREM2 actually help the immune system fight back?
Well, first off, blocking TREM2 could shift the balance back towards a pro-inflammatory state.
Okay.
So instead of suppressing the immune response,
Mhm.
those TAMs would start producing signals that attract and activate other immune cells, like T cells and NK cells, to actually attack the tumor.
So it's like switching the signal from stand down to charge.
Exactly.
But attracting the troops is only the first step, right?
Yeah.
What else happens when those TREM2 signals are blocked?
Right, we want those TAMs to be able to actually identify and engulf those tumor cells.
Right.
And that's where the second benefit comes in, enhancing what's called phagocytosis and antigen presentation.
Right.
So imagine the TAMs sort of presenting these tumor antigens to the rest of the immune system, like, hey, here's the enemy, let's take them down.
It's like putting up wanted posters for those cancer cells throughout the immune system's network.
Yes.
So we've got the troops rallied and ready to go. Are there any other ways that blocking TREM2 could, like, weaken the tumor's defenses?
Absolutely. Remember those other immunosuppressive cells? The ones that act like the tumor's personal bodyguards?
Right.
Well, blocking TREM2 could potentially disrupt that whole recruitment process, further weakening the tumor's protection.
So it's like a three-pronged attack.
Yeah.
Boosting the pro-inflammatory signals, enhancing the identification and engulfment of tumor cells, and like cutting off the tumor's reinforcements.
Right.
This is really starting to paint a picture of how powerful this strategy could be.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are some challenges and some considerations when it comes to actually developing these TREM2 blocking therapies.
You're absolutely right. There are always hurdles to overcome. And one of the biggest concerns is the potential for what we call off-target effects.
Right.
While we want to ramp up the immune response against the tumor, we don't want to trigger too much inflammation in healthy tissues.
Right. That makes sense. We need that immune response to be focused and
Yeah.
precise.
Exactly.
So are researchers looking into ways to mitigate those risks?
Absolutely. They're exploring different ways to target TREM2, including using antibodies that are specifically engineered to bind only to TREM2 on those TAMs within the tumor microenvironment.
So it's all about precision,
Yeah.
delivering the therapy exactly where it's needed most, and minimizing the impact on healthy tissues.
Yeah.
Are there other challenges that researchers are sort of grappling with
Yeah.
when it comes to developing these TREM2 targeted therapies?
One of the key challenges is understanding the interplay between TREM2 and other immune checkpoint molecules. You see, the immune system is like a really finely tuned machine with all these checks and balances to make sure that it doesn't go overboard.
Right.
And some of these checkpoint molecules like PD-1 and CTLA-4 can put the brakes on the immune response even when we want it to be active against the tumor.
I've heard about those checkpoint inhibitors, those drugs that release the brakes on the immune system.
Yeah.
And they've been revolutionary for some cancers, but I know they don't work for everyone.
Right.
Could TREM2 be the missing piece of the puzzle here, helping to overcome that resistance to checkpoint inhibitors?
That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
You know, remember how TREM2 can actually suppress the immune response? Well, that suppression might be one of the reasons why some tumors don't respond well to checkpoint inhibitors.
Interesting.
So researchers are exploring the idea of combining TREM2 blockade with checkpoint inhibitors to create this, more potent anti-tumor attack.
So it's like taking the brakes off the immune system with checkpoint inhibitors
Yeah.
and removing the suppressor, TREM2, that's holding it back.
Right.
To create this sort of 1-2 punch against the tumor.
Exactly. And it's not just checkpoint inhibitors. They're
Yeah.
also investigating how TREM2 blockade might enhance the effectiveness of other promising immunotherapies like CAR T-cell therapy.
Oh, CAR T-cell therapy.
Yeah.
That's where they re-engineer a patient's own immune cells to, recognize and destroy cancer cells.
That's right.
I know it's been a game changer for some blood cancers, but it hasn't been as successful with solid tumors.
Right.
Could TREM2 be the key to unlocking that potential in those harder to treat cancers?
That's the hope.
Yeah.
CAR T cells often struggle to survive and thrive in the immunosuppressive environment of solid tumors.
Right.
But by blocking TREM2, we might be able to create a more favorable environment for those CAR cells to actually do their job and making this therapy more effective against a wider range of cancers.
So it's like giving those CAR T cells the support they need to really infiltrate the tumor and do their job.
Exactly.
This is all starting to sound incredibly promising, but I know that translating these findings from the lab to the clinic, it can be a long and really complex process.
It is.
What are some of the next steps in the development of these TREM2 targeted therapies?
Well, one of the most important steps is conducting rigorous clinical trials to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of these therapies in actual humans.
Right.
There are already a number of clinical trials underway,
Wow.
testing TREM2 blocking antibodies in patients with a variety of cancers.
So we're starting to see that transition from the lab to the clinic, which is always an exciting milestone in research.
It is.
What are some of the key things researchers will be looking at in these clinical trials?
Well, they'll be closely monitoring the patients for any side effects, of course, to make sure that the therapies are safe.
Of course.
But they'll also be looking at how well the therapies actually work.
Okay.
Do they shrink tumors? Do they prolong survival?
Yeah.
If so, which types of cancers and which patients actually respond best?
Right, because even if a therapy is safe, it needs to actually be effective in fighting the cancer.
Of course.
It sounds like these clinical trials are going to be really crucial for determining the true potential of these TREM2 targeted therapies.
They are.
Before we move on to the future of TREM2 research,
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on something we briefly mentioned earlier, biomarkers. Can you explain what biomarkers are and why they're so important in this field?
Yeah, so biomarkers are essentially measurable indicators that can give us information about a biological process or a disease state.
Right.
In the context of TREM2, biomarkers could help us identify which patients are most likely to actually benefit from these therapies. For example, they're looking at the levels of TREM2 expression in tumors, as well as other genetic and molecular markers that might indicate whether a patient might be sensitive or resistant to these therapies.
So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach,
Yeah.
we're moving toward this more precise, individualized approach,
Exactly.
where treatments are tailored to the specific characteristics of each patient's tumor.
Right.
That's the ultimate goal of precision medicine, isn't it?
It is.
And it sounds like TREM2 could play a really key role in that quest.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And TREM2 has that potential to be a really valuable tool in that quest for personalized cancer care. It's all about understanding those intricacies of the tumor microenvironment,
Right.
identifying the key players,
Right.
and then developing these targeted therapies that can disrupt the tumor's defenses and ultimately unleash the power of the immune system.
This has been an absolutely fascinating dive into the world of TREM2
Yeah.
and its potential to, really revolutionize cancer treatment. But before we move on to the future of this research, I think let's take a quick break to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay. It's amazing to think that we're going from this broad brush approach to cancer treatment to something much more targeted and personalized.
It really is.
And TREM2 research is like a perfect example of that shift.
Yeah, it really is. But even with all this focus on TREM2, it's just one piece of a very complex puzzle, right? The tumor microenvironment, it's like teeming with all sorts of cellular players that are contributing to this immunosuppressive fortress.
Absolutely. It's like a whole ecosystem inside the body. And TAMs, those TREM2 expressing macrophages,
Right.
certainly major players, but there are others that are, just as important to understand.
Like those myeloid-derived suppressor cells.
Yes.
Or MDSCs.
Yes, MDSC.
They're like the tumor's personal security detail, aren't they?
Exactly. They infiltrate the tumor and they actively suppress the immune response,
Right.
making it even harder for the body's natural defenses to fight back.
So if we could find a way to, neutralize those MDSCs, it would be like cutting off the tumor's lifeline.
Precisely. And there's a lot of exciting research happening in that area.
Yeah.
Some scientists are exploring ways to directly target and eliminate MDSCs,
Right.
while others are actually looking at ways to reprogram them, much like we're trying to do with the TAMs.
Wow, so instead of being enemies,
Right.
these MDSCs could potentially be turned into allies.
Exactly. It's all about understanding how these cells are being manipulated by the tumor and finding ways to, re-educate them, so to speak.
And then there's another group of cells that are particularly intriguing, regulatory T cells or TREGs.
Oh, right, TREGs.
Yeah,
Those are the immune cells that normally keep everything in check.
exactly.
They prevent the immune system from overreacting and attacking healthy tissues.
That's right. They're essential for maintaining that immune balance.
Right.
But tumors can actually exploit TREGs, turning them into accomplices
Uh,
in their immune evasion schemes.
so instead of preventing friendly fire, these TREGs are actually shielding the tumor from attack.
Yeah,
That's so sneaky.
it is. And researchers are working on ways to, either deplete those TREGs in the tumor microenvironment
Okay.
or to modulate their activity so they no longer support that tumor growth.
It's like this constant game of chess
It is.
between the tumor and the immune system, with each side trying to, outmaneuver the other.
It is.
And it sounds like TREM2 research is giving us some really powerful new pieces to play with.
That's a great way to put it. And with each new discovery, we're gaining this, deeper understanding of this complex interplay, and we're developing more sophisticated strategies to tip the balance in favor of the immune system.
Speaking of new discoveries, where do you see the future of TREM2 research heading? Are we on the verge of seeing these therapies become like a reality for patients?
I'm very optimistic about the future of these TREM2 targeted therapies.
Yeah.
The preclinical data has been incredibly promising, showing that blocking TREM2 can really enhance anti-tumor immunity in a variety of cancer models.
Okay.
And as we discussed, there are already clinical trials underway testing these therapies in humans.
That's so exciting to hear.
That is,
But as with any new therapy, there are always challenges
of course.
to overcome.
Right.
What are some of the hurdles that researchers still need to address?
Well, safety is always a top priority, of course. We need to make sure that these therapies are, well tolerated, that any potential side effects are manageable.
Right. It's not just about attacking the tumor. It's about doing so in a way that, minimizes harm to the patient.
Exactly. And another challenge is understanding which patients are most likely to benefit from these therapies.
Right.
Not everyone responds to immunotherapies in the same way.
Right.
So identifying those biomarkers that can predict response is crucial.
So we were talking about this earlier, that idea of personalized medicine tailoring treatments to the individual patient.
Right.
Are there any specific biomarkers that researchers are sort of particularly focused on when it comes to TREM2?
Well, one of the most promising biomarkers is the level of TREM2 expression in the tumor itself.
Okay.
Some studies have suggested that patients with higher levels of TREM2 expression might respond better to the TREM2 blockade.
Interesting.
Researchers are also looking at genetic variations in the TREM2 gene
Hmm.
because those variations might influence how the protein functions and how patients respond to treatment.
So it's a combination of looking at both the tumor and the patient's genetic makeup to get a more complete picture.
Exactly. And as we gather more data from those clinical trials, we'll gain a much better understanding of which biomarkers are most predictive of response.
This all points to a future where cancer treatment is so much more precise
It does.
and tailored to the individual.
It really does.
Are there any other exciting areas of TREM2 research that you're particularly enthusiastic about?
One area that I find really fascinating is the potential of combining TREM2 blockade with other immunotherapies. As we've been discussing, TREM2 suppression might be one reason why some tumors just don't respond well to checkpoint inhibitors.
Right.
So there's a lot of interest in exploring whether combining TREM2 blockade with these checkpoint inhibitors could overcome that resistance and create a more potent anti-tumor response.
So it's like taking the brakes off the immune system with the checkpoint inhibitors
Right.
and then removing the suppressor TREM2 that's holding it back.
Exactly.
Are there other potential combinations that researchers are looking at?
Absolutely. There's a lot of excitement about combining TREM2 blockade with CAR T-cell therapy.
Okay.
We know CAR T-cells can be incredibly effective against some cancers,
Right.
but their success in solid tumors has been limited by that immunosuppressive environment.
Right.
But by blocking TREM2, we might be able to create a more favorable environment for those CAR T-cells to survive and thrive and make this therapy more effective against a wider range of cancers.
So it's like, giving those CAR T cells the support they need
Yes.
to really infiltrate the tumor and do their job.
Exactly.
It sounds like TREM2 blockade could be a game changer for a lot of patients.
I believe it has the potential to be.
Yeah.
It's still early days, of course,
Right.
but the research is moving forward rapidly,
Yeah.
and I'm confident we'll see significant progress in the coming years.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into this world of TREM2 and its potential role in really revolutionizing cancer treatment.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's one more area I want to touch on before we wrap up,
Oh,
and that is the ethical considerations surrounding this type of research.
that's an important point.
Yeah.
As with any new medical technology, we need to be mindful of those ethical implications.
Right.
And in the case of TREM2 targeted therapies, there are a few key considerations.
Like the potential for, off-target effects
Exactly.
that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
While we want to enhance the immune response against the tumor,
Yeah.
we need to be careful not to trigger excessive inflammation in healthy tissues.
Right.
And that means, carefully designing clinical trials, closely monitoring patients for any side effects, and constantly refining those therapies to minimize those risks.
Exactly. It's about finding that, sweet spot where we can maximize the benefits while minimizing any potential harms.
Right.
And another important consideration is access to these therapies.
Right.
If these TREM2 targeted therapies prove to be effective,
Yeah.
we need to make sure that they are available to all patients who could benefit, regardless of, their socioeconomic status or their geographic location.
Right. We don't want these groundbreaking treatments to only be accessible to a privileged few.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as with any new medical technology, there are also concerns about the cost.
Right.
TREM2 targeted therapies are likely to be expensive, at least initially.
Yeah.
So we need to find ways to make them more affordable and more accessible to all who need them.
It's a reminder that scientific progress
Mm-hmm.
needs to go hand in hand with ethical considerations.
It does.
We need to ensure that these advancements benefit all of humanity
Right.
and not just a select few.
I completely agree. It's about using our knowledge and our ingenuity to create a healthier and more equitable world for everyone.
Well said.
Thank you.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. But before we wrap up, I want to give you the last word.
Okay.
What's the one key takeaway that you hope our listener will glean from this deep dive into TREM2 and its potential to, transform cancer treatment?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is that we're really entering a new era of cancer immunotherapy, one that's driven by this, much deeper understanding of the immune system.
Right.
And it's complex interactions with cancer.
Yeah.
TREM2 is a prime example of how we're moving beyond those blunt, one-size-fits-all approaches.
Right.
And we're developing these therapies that are much more precise and personalized.
It's about harnessing the power of the immune system, but doing so with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, right?
Exactly.
And TREM2 research is really giving us the tools to make that precision possible.
It is. And as we continue to, sort of unravel the mysteries of the immune system,
Right.
I'm confident that we'll discover even more targets like TREM2, opening up this whole new arsenal of weapons to fight cancer.
And as we develop these new weapons, it's crucial that we wield them responsibly, right?
Absolutely.
Always considering those ethical implications.
Yeah.
And ensuring that these advancements actually benefit all of humanity.
Absolutely. It's about using our knowledge and our ingenuity to create a healthier and more equitable world for everyone.
That's a really powerful message. To our listener, we hope this deep dive into TREM2 has really shed some light on the incredible potential of immunotherapy.
Yeah.
And the groundbreaking research that's really paving the way for a brighter future. For cancer treatment, stay curious, stay informed, and remember that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to your health.
Absolutely.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the world of science and medicine. But until then, keep exploring. Here, Ball.